Hello and Assalamualaikum. My name is Syed Munawar. I'm your host. And this is PEMUDAH Forum in conjunction with 15 years anniversary of PEMUDAH. Exactly today, 15 years ago, PEMUDAH was established. And the idea behind it is to have a high-powered interministerial committee that tackles bureaucracy between businesses and government agencies. And of course, in the span of that 15 years, there has been ups and downs. But there are a lot that we can learn from, and even some of the major achievements serves as World Bank's case studies. So to enlighten us, we have three panelists altogether, two of whom are here with me in the studio. We have our distinguished speakers in the studio, 𝗣𝗀𝗁𝗂𝗨𝗗 𝗪𝗏, member of PEMUDAH, and Ms. 𝗤𝗂𝗁𝗂𝗏, Senior Economist of the World Bank. But before that, let us first of all hear it from the representative of OECD, Ms. Mariana Kartunen from the Regulatory Policy Division. Ms. Mariana is unable to join us in the studio. Nevertheless, she has prepared us a presentation entitled Past Lessons, Future Excellence and Productivity Breakthrough. And I'm sure that presentation encapsulates the essence behind 15 years of PEMUDAH. So without further ado, let's give it up to Ms. Mariana Kartunen.
Hello, thank you very much for attending today's session, and thank you very much for inviting me to participate in today's PEMUDAH Forum. Congratulations for the 15th anniversary, and it's really a pleasure and honor to be participating here today to be talking about past lessons, future excellence, and a productivity breakthrough with other distinguished panelists. I apologize for not being there live, but thank you very much to the organizers for having shared some questions with me to make this as interactive as possible. Now allow me just to share my screen. So, today's presentation, I will focus on international regulatory cooperation. Now, what is international regulatory cooperation? Why does it matter? What use can it be for PEMUDAH, its members, and of course Malaysia and the region? And how does the OECD support governments across the world in making use of international regulatory cooperation? First of all, what is international regulatory cooperation? Well, international regulatory cooperation is, or what we call IRC, is a key pillar of quality laws and regulation in a globalized context. So as this little illustration shows, and I'll be talking to you about throughout this presentation, the OECD has changed a bit the paradigm of rulemaking by considering that regulation today means looking beyond the borders. Now, what this means is that basically no policymaker or no regulator is an island. And like this lady here who is, so to say, a policymaker, there is even those who are working in isolation, working far from other regulators in other countries for whatever reason, there is a need to look beyond the borders to see what is going on in other countries, either to learn from others, to measure impacts better, to gain evidence from other jurisdictions, from stakeholders in other countries, or even to learn from best practices at international level. In many situations as well, there is a need for cooperation that can be either bilateral or multilateral in order to work towards a common solution. And in this sense, the OECD recommendation from 2012 on regulatory policy and governance when setting the 12 pillars of what a good regulation is, consider that international regulatory cooperation is one of those pillars. In other words, for a regulation to be effective and of good quality, it needs to take into account international considerations. The principle explicitly recommends that governments, regulators, policymakers, in developing regulatory measures, give consideration to all relevant international standards and frameworks for cooperation in the same field, and where appropriate, their likely effects on parties outside the jurisdiction. That is the recommendation, and based on that principle set in 2012, last year, the OECD Regulatory Policy Committee adopted best practice principles on international regulatory cooperation, which I will get into in a few moments. Now, why is international regulatory cooperation so important, and how can it be relevant in particular for PEMUDAH and its members or constituents to ease of doing business and improve quality of regulation? Well, today's policy priorities are increasingly transboundary, and international regulatory frameworks are struggling to keep up. Just the meeting that's happening right now is a signal that for so many different reasons that our world is totally interconnected, and that in particular the digitalization is pushing the limits of national boundaries, right? We're all in, or many of us are in different countries. We're getting together thanks to a virtual platform that's hosted in yet another jurisdiction. And how do regulators keep up with these technological changes? And in the background of all of this, and the reason for which we are not in the same room right now, is of course the global pandemic, and which has shown us as well that the domestic policy action can only be as effective as the entire global health system. So as long as there is the virus in one country, the whole world is at risk, right? And in addition, there's always both in many different fields across sectors, the reality of regulatory fragmentation, so different policy approaches across different countries, leaves space for what we call regulatory arbitrage. So basically, companies or citizens or whomever deciding to choose certain jurisdictions above others, and therefore not necessarily following the regulations of the countries in which they are. And why is this? Because regulations in certain countries can be especially costly, and moving from one to the other may create really too heavy burdens for them to bear. Now, better regulation is here precisely to address these challenges, and international regulatory cooperation in particular is the tool of better regulation for the interconnected world. It has three main kind of benefits that we observe. One is being able to tackle regulatory challenges at the level at which they occur. So basically being able to address, let's say, for example, transboundary air pollution. It cannot be tackled by one country alone, right? So countries who are typically two neighboring countries who have who share the same air as we all do, but who are very much affected by the activities of their neighbors, need to join their actions, their policy actions, so that the effects on fighting pollution are seen in both countries, just as an example. The second is economic efficiency. So avoiding unnecessary regulatory divergences. And this is what I'm going to be focusing on right now. In particular, because this is where business feel most of the costs of regulatory divergences. But in a nutshell, the International Regulatory Cooperation helps to reduce the costs of crossing borders. So basically, because regulations are so different from one country to another, and at the same time, companies cross borders all the time, whether physically or digitally or however, with their activities, with trading goods or services, there is unavoidably a huge tension there. And that is how international regulatory cooperation can help address that tension. Finally, administrative efficiency, simply by learning from others, regulatory cooperation can help improve, reduce the costs of searching for evidence and on the right policy. Now, a bit more on the trade costs of regulatory divergences and how international regulatory cooperation can help. We've identified three major types of costs: information costs for traders to look for the right regulations in other countries and therefore having to adapt, also the specification costs, and having to prove that they have adapted by undergoing conformity assessment procedures. So these are the information costs, specification costs, and conformity assessment costs. And the more there are different regulations that are difficult to find, that are very different from one country to another, and that require different procedures, the higher the costs for companies. That is on trade. In terms of quantification, of course, it's very difficult to estimate what the level of these costs are, but we did work on a survey with financial institutions, now not so much on trade costs, but more generally on the costs that regulatory divergences represented for companies in the financial sector. And this survey was sent out to 250 financial institutions, senior level management, which managed to, which showed very interesting evidence, showing in particular that regulatory divergences costs financial institutions 5 to 10% of their annual turnover on average, that regulatory divergences are particularly high for smaller organizations, and that more or less 73% of the responses reported that there has been an increase or even a substantial increase in the costs related to divergent regulations over the past 5 years. So that really means that there is a strong incentive also, not just for better regulation, but also for business to benefit from international regulatory cooperation. During COVID as well, it was particularly apparent that there was a need for finding policy responses to face the disease. There was a need for cooperation to secure access to essential goods, so that precisely these trade costs were not too high and companies managed to deliver the right goods to citizens and maintaining cross-border services. So typically services such as telecommunications or international travel that were heavily either needed, like telecommunications, internet, etc., or negatively affected, such as travel. Now, how does the OECD help governments in conducting international regulatory cooperation? Through these best practice principles? And this is going to be my last slide. Basically, the OECD recommends 3 overall lines of practice for governments, so that international regulatory cooperation can help them have better regulation and less costly regulation for business and citizens, that achieves the regulatory objective. First, with a IRC strategy and the appropriate governance behind it. Second, through international considerations throughout domestic rulemaking, and typically through the different regulatory policy tools, such as regulatory impact assessments, such as stakeholder engagement with foreign stakeholders, and consideration of international standards, or finally through cooperating internationally with peers, bilaterally, regionally, or multilaterally, through regional cooperation such as ASEAN, APEC, or through trade agreements in which there are international regulatory cooperation provisions, or mutual recognition agreements that allow to reduce, in particular, conformity assessment costs. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm sorry I've run out of time, but we have a lot more on our website on country experiences, and I'd be happy to follow up in writing if you have any specific questions. Thank you very much.
On behalf of the organizer, I would like to thank Ms. Mariana Kartunen from the Regulatory Policy Division of OECD for the presentation. And after 15 years of running across peaks and valleys, we are here today to commemorate its 15 years of achievement, and perhaps to also find areas where we can do fine-tuning. The road which PEMUDAH has undertaken was not without challenges, I'm sure. Perhaps we will ascertain new insights as well as silver lining, which later can help us in building the next building blocks. So this is PEMUDAH Forum in conjunction with 15 years of PEMUDAH establishment. Welcome, everyone. I would like to introduce our speakers. The first speaker is 𝗪𝗀𝗁 Tiaguan, members of PEMUDAH. I was told that 𝗪𝗀𝗁 has been with PEMUDAH since day one, Dato'.
Yeah. I'm actually one of the founding member.
You are one of the founding member. That's very good. Yeah. Thank you very much, Dato'. And also we have Ms. 𝗪𝗀𝗁 𝗪𝗂𝗁, senior economist of the World Bank. Hi, 𝗪𝗪𝗁.
Hi, Syed. Very nice to be here.
Yeah, thank you for joining us today. If I may begin with 𝗪𝗀𝗁, you have been with PEMUDAH since, in fact, you are the founding member of PEMUDAH, and you're being a prominent businessman yourself. In retrospect, prior to having PEMUDAH, what was it like? And now you are being a member of PEMUDAH for 15 years. You've seen the ups and downs of trying to facilitate dealings between businesses and government. So now it has been 15 years. In retrospect, what have you seen, and what can you share with us, Dato'?
Thank you, Syed. Of course, I think at the initial stage of the establishment of PEMUDAH did face many challenges. Of course, the first one is the resistance to change is actually very apparent. But with the very strong political will from the then Prime Minister and also the Chief Secretary to the government, who is also the co-chair of the PEMUDAH. And all these issues are actually being addressed. Now, I still remember in the first meeting, what we heard, there are a few taglines. First one is business no longer as usual. That was what the Director General of Public Services told the audience. And if you cannot do it, then we will get someone else to do it for you. And the third, which I still remember, is the big, hairy, audacious goal we had, right? And of course, talking about the challenges, the other very important one is actually building the mutual trust between the public and private sector, which is actually very important. And I still remember in a very heated argument, the co-chair actually asked one of the PEMUDAH member, "Are you for public or private sector?" Say, do you know what is the answer?
Yeah, I'm curious as well.
That member, who is actually 𝗪𝗪𝗀,
Okay.
he said that I am for Malaysia.
All right. That's very patriotic.
I am for the country. Okay. So at PEMUDAH, when we approach any issues, it is not the issue of public or private sector. It is all our problem and all our issue we need to tackle together. And as a private sector member of PEMUDAH, we always remind ourselves that what is good for business may not be good for the country. What is good for the country may not be good for the business in the short run. That's why all together, between the public and private sector, we have to collaborate for the betterment of Malaysia. Right?
Right. Yeah. Dato', in deciding whether are you for public or for the business, has there been a real conflict in deciding in your case?
Actually, no. You see, even though I'm actually a businessman myself, but whenever we make a decision, we have to look at it from a long-term perspective, what is actually good for the country. And we are not fighting for business, we are actually fighting for the country. And in deciding anything, I think the national interest will come first before we make any decision, right?
Yeah. Yes, moving on to Smita, I'm sure you have seen it across the globe, and I'm sure PEMUDAH is not PEMUDAH and its like. It's not uniquely for Malaysia. It's not only Malaysia having the like of PEMUDAH, but from your observation, Smita, how has PEMUDAH affected businesses in Malaysia during the pandemic and in the past 2 years, in particular, Smita?
Thanks, Syed. Actually, as Dato' Chua pointed out, it's not it wasn't easy to set up PEMUDAH. But I think one shouldn't discount the amount of the effort and also the effect PEMUDAH has had on for Malaysia's public-private dialogue. Right. While there may have been lots of such initiatives, it is not as easy to be so successful because there are certain incentives that need to be aligned. And what really worked, actually, Dato' Chua really pointed out what really worked and why it worked was that the public and the private sector was working towards a common goal, and which was economic development for Malaysia. And I think that's very important to kind of highlight, because many times you may have these public-private partnership dialogue platforms, but this alignment doesn't always take place. And it is actually very unique what we see in PEMUDAH, because a lot of the private, I mean, actually all of private sector who participate does this pro bono and does it out of genuine interest to further the ease of doing business in Malaysia, with the aim to actually improve Malaysia's competitiveness and have greater economic growth. In fact, during the pandemic, there is a role, even a greater role for a dialogue platform like PEMUDAH, because the voices of the private sector need to be heard by the public sector in order to inform the public policy, in order for the public policy not to be too far removed from the pulse of the businesses. And I think that's a really important role that PEMUDAH has played in the past, and I think it's going to be even more important during and post the pandemic. Syed?
Yeah. Dato' Chua, we mentioned earlier that you have been with PEMUDAH since day one. It has been 15 years, January this year. And I'm sure there have been, some peaks and valleys along the way. But can you share some of the details of how the high impact project affected businesses in Malaysia?
I guess one of which, and even the World Bank have actually take it as a case study worldwide, is actually the setting out of the new commercial court. And prior to the year 2010, the entire court hearing process for a commercial case in Malaysia could actually take up to 9 years to complete. And this ended up with more than 2,000 cases, backlog cases during that point in time. And the impact is actually very serious because this has resulted in certain quarters actually abuse the court system to delay cases. And also, in terms of investor, were very concerned as to whether they could actually enforce a commercial contract in Malaysia on a timely basis. And we also see in the private sector, there are many private sector agreements actually citing Singapore for dispute resolution instead of Malaysia. So, Syed, you could actually see how serious it is, when it actually takes 9 years to complete a court hearing. And of course, I think compliment must be given to the then Chief Justice, who is Tun Zaki, who is willing to actually acknowledge the problem, and in consultation with Bermuda Working Group on enforcing contract, we have actually taken two-pronged strategies. First of which is actually to set up a new commercial court, to look into the new cases. Reason being that is, if you keep looking at the old cases, you will never get it done, right? So you actually set up a new commercial cases to look at new cases. Whereas for the 2,000 old cases, then what has been decided is actually to fast track it and to complete within the next 2 years. So you actually have a two-pronged measure. One is to look at the new cases, and the other one is actually to look at the old cases and set it as a target. And Syed, do you know what happened? What's the impact to this?
Yes, please.
You get the impact is the court hearing process has been reduced from 9 years to 9 months.
Okay.
I'm talking about 9 months.
That's what. That's not even 100%. That's 1,000% improvement, I suppose.
Exactly. And then you must be asking me that. How would this be able to achieve, right? So other than the two-pronged strategy, which I was talking about just now, then obviously, in the past, we have been hearing there were a lot of postponement of cases, court cases, and the finger has been pointed to judges. But however, when Bermuda did a study, it actually shows that 80% of the postponement were actually requested by the lawyers, not the judges. So as a result of that, there was very strict rules set that no postponement of cases. So you could see nowadays, even the court hearing process can run up to in the evening or at night, in that sense. So that's number one. No more postponement. Now, secondly is the judiciary have actually appointed more experienced judges with specialized knowledge of commercial law. So then, you actually have more judges to look into the cases. And thirdly, very important, this is actually something very important. Use the IT to enhance the court hearing efficiency. This includes, the e-filing of the court cases, where, the lawyer can actually do it 7/24 real time online. That's number one. It's just like when you file your tax return, you can do e-filing, right? So similar here. You can actually do the e-filing for your court cases. Number two, judiciary also introduced case management system electronically. So then, the Chief Justice himself can actually have a dashboard to know the status of all the cases. So then he can actually intervene whenever he needs. Thirdly, there is an electronic queue management system. So no one can actually cut queue in this case. All right. And number four, this is even more important, the court recording and the transcription system. This will actually speed up the issuance of the written judgment. All right. So with the IT, with all this commitment, this is where, the court hearing process has been shortened from 9 years to 9 months, like what I said just now. Of course, the new commercial court have actually enhanced the investor confidence and reduce the cost of enforcing a commercial contract in Malaysia. And these have actually led to more private sector investment, right?
Yeah. Now, I would like to bring that anecdote, that sample, that case study back to Smita, because, shortening the span of 9 years to 9 months is a remarkable feat. I'm sure this is not only unique to Malaysia. There are many other instances across the board, across the globe. Now, Smita, as I mentioned earlier, I'm sure the experience of PEMUDAH is not only unique to Malaysia. The like of PEMUDAH, I'm sure World Bank is looking, overseeing across the globe, many other countries' experiences. Maybe you can share some other initiatives, some other cases, since Dato' just now mentioned that this is a typical case study happening in Malaysia. So, World Bank is looking into it. What about other cases in other countries, Smita?
Thanks, Said. So basically, there are various models. So in PEMUDAH, what happened was that PEMUDAH decided to work across certain areas that in the firm's life cycle. In other countries, we've had successful cases where, for example, in Peru, we have something called the 𝗍𝗂𝗍𝗂𝗍 executives. So it is basically a private-public partnership that works in sectors. So what happens is the sectoral dialogue, which goes in depth, which actually influences sectoral regulations. And again, the reason why this works is that the composition of these public-private dialogues is such that there is the relevant people from the private sector, but it's also getting heard by the relevant people in the public sector. So what is very important, there are other cases for example, there's also a case in Cambodia where there was, again, they were working on investment climate issues. So all of these issues, all of this, what are the unique points or the salient features that actually work in their favor? First is to have buy-in at the highest level in the public sector, because if you want to influence policy, you need to be heard. And as Dato' Chua mentioned, the Chief Secretary plays a very important role here. He's the co-chair. And another important thing is that the private sector has an equally important role. So, for example, in Bermuda, it is co-chaired by the private sector. And each of the working groups, whether it's in PEMUDAH or ME in Peru, was comprised of members that were technical experts, so that you can really get to the granular details or the granular issues that affected, in the case of Peru, the sector, or in the case of PEMUDAH, that particular area of business regulation that was being looked at. So the only reason that, for example, Dato' Chua's example, they were able to bring it down from 9 years to 9 months was they were able to very clearly delineate where exactly is the delay. And that can only be done if you really look at the nitty-gritty details of all the participants, of all the stakeholders, and all the time that it takes through the entire life cycle of that particular process. And that's where you can see where is the bottleneck. And that is very, very important, to be able to have that depth in technical expertise and the weight in terms of having the real, the important decision makers, both from the private as well as the public sector, being represented. I would like to also note that one of the issues of having public-private dialogue, one of the pitfalls can be that you can have a private sector which does not actually cater to the majority of the private sector. That you could actually look at, having a monopolization of interests. So that is again something that needs to be very carefully avoided, and that has been avoided in the cases where they have been successfully able to influence policy.
Smita, you're mentioning about there are various models of doing this. So out of curiosity, are we able to dissect and maybe categorize the kinds of model? And how does one particular country decide which model is the best? What does it take for us to decide what works and what doesn't work to respective countries? Smita.
Sure. So, Said, I guess it depends on what the country wants to work on, right? So, if you want to work on horizontal policies which are sector agnostic, the
Okay.
PEMUDAH model or the Cambodia model works best because you want to just facilitate business entry. So, you want to make sure that across the life cycle of the business, there is really no obstacle. But there may be certain other countries, for example, in Peru, where they decided that we really need to identify what is the sectoral issue. But having said that, they also work across. So they identify sectoral issues across various sectors, and then look at synergies across these different sectors to build on horizontal policies that can be worked on.
Okay.
So it's all about the approach that a country decides is most effective. But again, you need to have, if you go by the sectoral approach, you need to have a critical mass of representatives from those
Okay.
sectors who will be able to give that amount of time that is required to really dissect the issues, because this is a time intensive process. So it would be very nice, for example, to understand
Yeah.
this from this example that Atochua mentioned. What did it take in terms of the working group working on that particular case? How many months of or years of working together? How many hours of all these people's time are we looking at in terms of just making that difference, which is huge, but it also takes a lot of effort.
Yeah. Sai, if I may add
Yes.
on,
Silakan, Dr. Chua.
now Smita mentioned about the devil is actually in the detail. And this is where I think PEMUDAH is very lucky to have a very strong secretariat, which is actually MPC. They normally look into the whole process and they do the time motion study. All right. So like what Smita said just now, in the time motion study, then we will see which process or procedure, how long it takes to complete that procedure. And along the way, we also actually have this thing called guillotine approach. Okay. To actually do away with those licenses or permits which is actually not required. And along the way, we also have this thing called business process re-engineering. Okay. We don't just take everything and computerize it, okay, or put it into the electronic form. I think more importantly is as to whether that process itself does actually bring value to the entire system itself. All right. So this is where I guess the support from the MPC is actually very important, and we will be able to see where's the bottleneck, like what Smita said just now. Yeah.
Yeah, that's why this forum is being organized by MPC. Because in the realization of the importance of PEMUDAH. By the way, if I may recall, Smita, you're mentioning about the effectiveness of a particular policy intervention. It also boils down to the size of the stakeholders, the involvement of the stakeholders. If I'm not mistaken, there is an enterprise survey being done, and it has been reported by World Bank before this, indicating that in Malaysia, the size of the big companies as compared to the smaller ones. In fact, we also have the micro SMEs, So it seems like the micro and the smaller ones is the majority that represents the interest of the group. So how does this dichotomy, the imbalance in sizes, because the effectiveness, the most productive are only the bigger ones. So when it comes to policy intervention, how does this affect the effectiveness of any measures being introduced by the like of PEMUDAH from your observation, Smita?
That's a very good point, Said. So what was interesting was in the case of PEMUDAH and the initiatives that they really tried to push through, that they wanted it to really make a difference for the small firm. So and this was something that so the idea was, how do you facilitate it or make it easier for the smaller firms to, for example, enter the market or to obtain a license. So it is important to actually look at the unit. In this case was the SME. So in a way, that took care of the fact that you're looking at what really affects the smaller player who has a disadvantage, but in Malaysia comprises the majority.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
So again, Dato', the devil is in the details, yeah, Dato'. So data has always been an issue here because we are not lack of data, but perhaps maybe in understanding the data. So will the sector be able to help you in deciding as far as PEMUDAH is concerned? Because we need credible analytical findings in order for us to come up with very effective policy intervention, Dato'.
Correct. Now, as you know, the PEMUDAH is actually a collaboration between private and public sector. This is where the detailed study will be done. Even in the case of the setup of new commercial court, we have done numerous study. Of course, then judiciary is the one which is actually taking the lead in the sense. Now, and of course, with the help of MPC, I think we can actually do benchmarking against the global best practice as well. And then we see what is actually suitable for Malaysia. Sometimes there are certain things which is done in overseas country may not be suitable for Malaysia at this juncture, right? So then we actually have to see what are the measures and what are the best practice that we can actually emulate and implement in Malaysia in that sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
Dato', can we pick questions from the audience? Because it seems like we have audience, wanting your response on some of the issues being raised here. I think this particular question pertains to PEMUDAH. How does public sector legitimize PEMUDAH recommendations and solutions? It's from Tisha Penang. Dato', I suppose this is for you to address.
All right. You see, we are looking at a collaboration between public and private sector for the betterment of Malaysia. All right. And in this case, like what I say earlier, whenever we approach an issue or a problem brought in by the business community, we look at it as our problem or our issue all together. So in PEMUDAH, the private and public sector work as a team. And this is where we both address the issue together and decide on the matter itself, what would be the best solution in the best interest of the country, which is Malaysia.
Okay. And moving on to Smita, I mentioned earlier on as well with regards to the PEMUDAH enterprise survey being done. Of course, we have to put that as a backdrop to our discussion in 50-year celebration of PEMUDAH. There was an outcome which you have deliberated quite lengthy, and I think it's only meaningful if we address that the red flags being raised by World Bank. So, in a nutshell, maybe in essence, what have we seen? What are the findings of the PEMUDAH outcome, and how do we put this in the context of our discussion with regards to the establishment of PEMUDAH? Smita.
Thanks, Syed. A very good question. In terms of the kind of the important issues that have come out is the difference in productivity between Malaysian firms and that of aspirational countries, that is countries that Malaysia aspires, given that Malaysia aspires to be a high-income nation, and the increasing differences in productivity between the productive firms in Malaysia and the less productive firms. And this is especially the case. We find that the SMEs lag in productivity. And some of the issues that we've been able to find are causing this lack of productivity-led growth, as we call it, is the issue of skills, to be able to get skilled labor, or the lack of innovative activity being undertaken at the level of the firm. So in that backdrop, I think going forward, it is going to be very important for this continued dialogue between the private and the public sector, because not just the study, other studies, we did a study on the level of effectiveness of research being done and the level of commercialization happening in Malaysia. So while there are certain centers of excellence, we find that there is a disconnect between the research being done in research universities and institutions and that is found in the private sector. And how do you make sure that this gap doesn't exist? To bridge this gap, there is this the need for this public-private dialogue and platforms to exist, so that the research that is done is much more demand-driven, that it leads to increased productivity for firms. Similarly, in the issue of skills. So firms constantly complain we're not being able to get skilled labor. This is going to be an issue of the supply. So how there needs to be a feedback mechanism from the firms to public institutions to higher education curriculum, such that the curriculum keeps up with what the private sector needs and is able to produce a good supply of talented workforce that will be able to increase productivity of firms in Malaysia.
Okay, yeah. I'm sure a lot has been done, Datuk Chua, but there's still room for improvement. So normally, how does PEMUDAH respond to this kind of observation from World Bank?
You see, the role of PEMUDAH itself, forever, I think we have to improve ourselves. All right. To me, the national competitiveness is actually an endless marathon. While we are being more competitive, the other countries are also improving themselves. That's why we cannot stand still. We need to actually run faster and faster, so then we can compete in this global world. And this is where I think PEMUDAH will continue to improve and facilitate the ease of doing business towards enhancing the productivity and also the national competitiveness by reducing time and cost of doing business overall.
Right. Yeah, this is not a 100-meter sprint, Dato'. So this is a marathon. You need to have a very large lung.
We have been running for 15 years already.
15 years.
We are here today.
All right. Can we have another question from our audience? I would like to give this question to Smita. Since we are now talking about future undertakings on the next building block. So in terms of next course of action, a shift, how do we help, or perhaps maybe how do we facilitate the the next step for PEMUDAH to shift from service delivery efficiency to long-term issues of quality? Yeah, this is from Shaza Seremban. Smita.
So that's a great question and kind of a good segue to what I'd started discussing. Going forward, there is a role for PEMUDAH and very involved public-private dialogue on the issue of quality, the quality of skills, the quality of research, and the quality of innovation that is happening at the level of the firms. And this cannot happen without this constant dialogue between the public and the private sector to know what exactly are the obstacles, because the government does put in a lot of money. So is that really solving the problems that it aims to solve? Is it really providing the solutions that the private sector is looking for? So unless and until this dialogue is a continuous dialogue takes place, there's always going to be an avenue to do a lot more in terms of long-term issues of productivity growth, which will in the end all boil down to having a very competitive workforce and an ecosystem that fosters greater research and development and innovation by firms, so that they're constantly competitive and they're able to maintain as well as increase their markets with this constantly evolving global value chains. Just for example, now there is a lot of emphasis on having more sustainable and greener products. This is going to affect our smaller firms in Malaysia, for example. So how do you build the capacity of those firms? What is required? What is the infrastructure required? What are the quality standards required? And that can only happen with a close dialogue between the public and the private sector, so that you can equip the private sector to be able to take on the challenge that the new changing global landscape throws, and be constantly competitive vis-a-vis its regional as well as global peers.
I fully support what Smita is saying. And you see, from PEMUDAH, we can actually provide very timely feedback to the government. So then the government can actually make immediate policy changes in view of the changes in the landscape of the world. So this is where I guess PEMUDAH being a bridge between the public and private sector is actually very important and can play a very effective role in this sense.
Right. Smita, in comparison to all other initiatives across the globe, so what is the one unique strength that PEMUDAH has from your observation?
What is really striking is the real commitment through all these 15 years that industry stalwarts have shown in this initiative. And this is very commendable, because this is just, there is no monetary incentive. So there is basically, this is just done out of pure commitment to furthering business environment in Malaysia. So that is definitely something that is very commendable. And the fact that PEMUDAH has been able to maintain this high level of engagement at the public and the private sector by having this co-chair arrangement at the highest level, and hence being this bridge, being able to influence policy making.
All right, Dr. Cho, what's the next big thing for? Okay, let me reconstruct the question. Let's make it even more interesting. Normally when I host a question, the like of this anniversary thing, I would like to give my guest, speaker, especially to you, Dato' Chua, since you are the founding member of PEMUDAH, a magic wand, tongkat sakti. Dato', I'm giving you a tongkat sakti, a magic wand, for you to use that in whichever sector, on whatever manner and ways that you wish. So if you have that magic wand, being a member of PEMUDAH, how will you make use of that magic wand to make things better for PEMUDAH and for the nation in time to come?
This answer has not been changed since 15 years ago. Okay. I think the aim is actually together we want to make Malaysia a great place to do business and a wonderful place to live. Not just to do business, but it's actually for the rakyat and for everyone who are living in Malaysia to actually have a wonderful place to live.
Okay.
Sai?
Yeah. If I were to bid happy birthday, so will you be you be the representative of PEMUDAH, definitely. Happy 15 years anniversary. And I think thank you very much for being here with us in this forum, to you, Dato' Chua, and also to Smita, representative of the World Bank. And thank you to all our audience, as well as those questions being picked during this session. And once again, we wish all the good things coming through the ways of PEMUDAH, for the betterment of the country as a whole. So thank you once again, and I see you all next time. Assalamualaikum and salam muhibah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Syed, and to PEMUDAH, and all the best.
Thank you.